So we've just been talking about the moon and very large things, and now we're going to talk about some very small things. Let's imagine that I'm a red blood cell. So I'm the most common type of cell in the blood, and as Jennifer Gardy reminded us yesterday, there's no nucleus, and so there's no DNA. Yet the red blood cells have very important responsibilities. And this is that actually they're doing a lot of traveling throughout the body. So they have to go everywhere, basically, and deliver goods to other cells throughout the body. So even though they're the most common part of the blood, they're very important with a large responsibility. So from the heart and lungs, they're traveling throughout the body, going from the larger arteries all the way through smaller parts, all the way down into smaller capillaries. This is going all the way through the torso, through the arms, fingers, legs, toes. So you can imagine that actually, starting in the larger arteries all the way down to the capillaries, it's a bit like starting in Wembley Stadium with your friends and ending up caving under the caves of Bristol underneath. It's a tiny tube that they're trying to get through, but it'll get there eventually. But this is what it has to do in the process of traveling throughout the entire body, these red blood cells. Now, red blood is made up of several parts, including plasma, white blood cells, platelets as well. And red blood cells, along with plasma, for example, they have the job of carrying oxygen and glucose throughout the body. I might just talk about it as sugar for now, which makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so we've got this oxygen, and we've got sugar. Now, the great thing is that actually, it's a bit like walking around party with the food and drinks that you're willing to share. Everyone wants to see you. You're the life of the party, as you're kind of going around to people and saying, yes, okay. Hi, yes, I'm a red blood cell. Yes, I've got oxygen and I've got sugar. You can imagine walking around the party. Everyone wants to talk to you and everyone wants you there. It's great. You're delivering this along the way. Yep, okay, yeah, great, hi. Thanks, nice to meet you. The commute on the tube, yeah, it was a little crowded getting here, but I made it. Yeah, thanks, happy to be here. So the thing is that you're delivering this, the red blood cells are delivering this throughout the body, but actually, when it comes to the brain and delivering it to the brain, it's a matter of life or death. And that's because the blood flow is the only means for getting this to the brain. And our brain, even though it's only 2% of our body mass, it uses up 20% of the oxygen that we breathe and 25% of the glucose. It's a bit greedy. But actually, this is the only way it gets there. It can't store any of the oxygen or glucose in the brain itself. So even after 6 minutes with no oxygen, brain cells will start to die. So it's very important. So why do these brain cells or neurons need so much energy? Well, I think it's time for us to meet a neuron. I'll see what I have. It might be time for a costume change as well. Yes, okay, good. They do a lot of thinking, so I think I need to get this on appropriately here. Good. Yes. Okay, and just to top it off, there we go. Okay, let's put this over on the side here. So, we've got neurons now. Neurons, or the brain cells, do all the thinking, right? They control functions in your body. From muscle movement to memory to learning to respiration, everything. They're thinking about all of this. And with all of this firing and things that they're doing, they need a lot of food. And that's why they need the blood. So they live the longest as the brain cells, and they don't normally divide. And this is why people wear your helmets. We've only got one brain, and we need to take care of it. So let's imagine now. Okay, so these brain cells, or neurons, a lot of times they're just sitting at rest. They're reading, maybe enjoying their environment, looking around a little bit. But actually, what they're doing is they're listening to their neighbors, the neurons that are out there surrounded by them, and they're thinking, okay, listening, waiting for a signal, until all of a sudden they say, boom, it's time to fire, and then they sit back down. So this is what's happening with the neurons. And in a sense, it's the membrane potential, or the voltage, that's changing. So they're sitting down, kind of waiting, listening for neighbors, and then all of a sudden they think, fire, right, it's time to go. These are the neurons that are actually firing. And all of this firing can get tiring after a while. So they need to refuel and get more energy in order to get their charge back. And now, who delivers that fuel to them with the oxygen and the glucose? Red blood cells. Great, I knew those neurons were firing. That's exactly right. So, great. Now, so our brains desperately need this blood flow, because this is the only means that it can actually get there. But hang on, what happens when we look at brain injury? When that happens, these neurons that are trying to fire are actually getting battered, right? They're swelling the same way that if you drop a hammer on your foot, the next day you wake up and your foot's a bit more swollen. It's the same thing with neurons even. And so that they need help and fuel inside the brain to work on this healing process. And in addition to that, the demand for energy actually goes up, and yet at the same time, the infrastructure for actually getting this blood supply to those damaged parts of the brain are often cut off themselves. It's a bit like highways and roads leading to a village that becomes flooded, that all of a sudden it's cut off and you can't actually get supplies to where they need to go. It's the same thing. And you can imagine that there's quite a bit of demand on this, and the brain has a reaction where it will actually try to, in a sense, restart the neuronal engines, and it sends this slow wave of electrical activity across the surface of the brain, and that's where all of the neurons are firing and depolarizing, or standing up and sitting down. And when you've got more than 80 billion neurons, that's a lot of firing that's going on. So we need a lot of fuel for this. But it's also been shown that in brain injury, that more than 50 to 60% of brain-injured patients have these slow electrical waves that go across the surface of the brain. And unfortunately, the more of these waves that occur, the worse the prognosis for the patient. So we'd like to know when this is actually happening. So this is now an image of a human brain, looking at it using laser speckle imaging. And in this case, it was actually damaged. The patient had enough damage that they had surgery and had to remove part of the skull as well. So this is showing here. We can see in this section where these red bits are coming up. Those are actually showing greater blood flow. So in this case, these are normal parts right here, kind of blood flow coming up through here. The yellow section shows blood flow, but maybe not quite as much. And so a reminder that when we look at injured brains, we often see this slow wave of electrical activity passing across. So now I'm going to show a video of what this looks like when it's actually passing. You can see this building here, this storm-like activity that's traveling up through the brain, over the surface, away, the infarct from this damaged area of the brain. Now that was fairly fast in the video, but actually it took place over 20 minutes. So it's slowed down in real time. And yet, it'd be a little bit better if we could watch it in a little bit slower time. So you can see that it's building up here. It's going up over the ridge, down into the valley, and then it's coming up on the other side. All the while, it's following this electrical wave of activity. And it's coming up, and so that's blood that's rushing in, trying to bring in the oxygen and glucose, because again, it's the only thing that can fuel the brain. So this whole activity, we see it, but actually it kind of reminds me of something with the standing up and sitting down for all of these neurons that are firing. I'm trying to really give you an idea of what's happening when we see the video. So it reminds me of something else that I think we should look at as well, with all of this energy and activity that's happening. So it's actually like a wave. And it's going around the stadium. A wave, all of these neurons are firing. They're all firing. They all want the oxygen and glucose and the blood flow coming back in. And yet it's coming in, it's going up over another valley or ridge and down into the valley, and it's coming out. And you can feel the amount of energy that's happening. So it's really to give you an idea that when we see all of this happening, it looks quiet, and maybe it is to our ears, but actually there's a lot of energy that's happening during this brain injury. This is about the week that they're in intensive care, and we're trying to figure out how to then figure out which ones need earlier intervention. So let's even slow down and look at a smaller section and see what's actually happening during this wave. Slow motion. We're looking at it, the waves coming past us. And all of a sudden it stops. So let's look at what's happening now. This is the wave of the neurons that actually is going through. So if we were to take this image, we have a direction of this flow, the direction of the wave that's actually traveling across. And yet each of those has the neurons that's firing everywhere from sitting down to then standing up, and it's trying to get the blood flow back in and recharge with the oxygen and glucose. So all of that is actually working its way through with the oxygen, or with the red blood cells coming in, and it's refueling. That's good if it's able to refuel. The problem is when it cannot actually refuel. So in a sense, we want to know when the electrical wave is actually occurring, because if the blood flow can't get there, eventually those brain cells are going to die. So let's remember as well that this electrical signal that we're looking at, it's actually, they're numbers that we're looking at, say from an action potential, but it's actually telling us a story. So as it travels across, we can then look at how those numbers translate into a signal, which translates into telling us the story of what's actually happening. So in this case, we're looking at 4 channels of brain activity on the surface of the brain in this case. And rather than just having numbers or signals, once you know what you're looking for, and this is similar to what Erin said yesterday in her talk from Wordnik about knowing what the needle in the haystack is. You have to start trying to figure out what you're looking for. But in this case, we can see that the wave of electrical activity is traveling in a certain direction, and we can also see that in this case, some of the electrical activity is recovering afterwards. So we know that this type of brain tissue is still able to handle this storm of activity that's coming through. The difficulty comes when all of a sudden you lose some of this activity afterwards and that the electrical activity is quiet, because then our neurons aren't firing and we're not thinking. So just to put this into perspective as well. So again, this is happening in the intensive care. And I'm doing a PhD at Imperial College London, and we have a collaboration with King's College. And at King's, there is a TV show on Channel 4 called 24 Hours in A&E. And it's like a fly-on-the-wall documentary showing everything that's actually happening in there over a 24-hour period. And this is basically where the patients are coming in and they're being monitored from the beginning. So of all the things that might happen that they're being monitored for, it could be electrical activity in the brain or in the heart, or intracranial pressure, which is the pressure actually inside your skull, the arterial pressure in the body, as well as oxygen levels and brain temperature levels. So there are a lot of different signals that we're actually looking at. And there are more things that we can learn about this as well from this data that's coming through. For example, there's something called cerebral autoregulation. And this is basically a mechanism that occurs in all of our brains, which is trying to regulate the flow of blood into the brain. Again, remember, we need this flow of blood desperately, and we all have this mechanism that regulates it. So in this case, there's a kind of a flat plateau area here, and that indicates that it's able to keep the blood flow steady regardless of how the blood pressure is varying. So that's what we want in a healthy brain. In an injured brain, unfortunately, you lose this plateau area here. So this all of a sudden means that as the blood pressure goes up, that the blood flow is growing up, then the intracranial pressure is going up, and when you get too high of intracranial pressure, that can mean that then the pressure is so great that it starts actually damaging otherwise healthy tissue in the brain. You don't want that. That's secondary brain injury. On the other hand, if there's too little blood flow, then the neurons are not able to repolarize. So there's a fine balance that we're trying to get here. And this is what we can get with all of this data. So with the data that comes through, so at 200 hertz, then that's 200 times per second that we're getting a signal or a point from one of these signals. But over an hour, that's 720,000 data points. And a 24-hour period, that's 17 million points. So all of a sudden, you're getting a lot of data, and we're often looking at 20 signals at a time, many patients in the intensive care, and many of them over multiple days. So there's a lot of data that can help you to figure out what's happening in the intensive care. So there's something called the coastal paradox, and this helps to explain why high-resolution data is so helpful. So in this case, when we look at high-resolution data, that's a short period of time between data points. If you were looking at length, that's using a short ruler to measure length, for example. So if we look at the coast of the UK using this short ruler, we get a pretty good indication of what the UK coastline looks like. And let's say we wanted to sail a boat into the Bristol Channel. So we wanted to come in on this side over here. So, okay, we can do that. But if we go down to slightly lower resolution data, that means we have a longer measuring stick. All of a sudden, okay, we can still tell about what the UK looks like. But actually, if we're sailing into the Bristol Channel, yeah, we can still figure out about where it is. That's okay. But the lowest resolution data, then the longest time stick, then all of a sudden, you can't see the Bristol Channel at all. So this is just an example of showing that actually high-resolution data has many more layers of information that can help us with the story. So I hope that whether you're using code, which we talked about, of MATLAB or Python or R or some other code to analyze your data, that you can see that whether it's in the intensive care or any other aspect, that high-resolution data really can help you to dive further into the landscape and to bring your story into focus. Thank you.